Chapter 4, The First Fracture. The coat was wrong. She knew it the moment she stepped off the lift cage and into Holloway's air, which tasted of metal shavings and something organic underneath, something almost sweet, like fruit rotting in a warm room. The coat was too clean. She'd rubbed it against the tile floor of her lab, had even pressed the collar into a streak of machine oil on the workbench edge, but it still hung on her with the posture of a high island garment, structured at the shoulders, unbothered by weather. She pulled it tighter and kept moving. Holloway Market occupied the lowest accessible tier of the sunken island, which meant the sky above it was not sky at all, but the scarred underbelly of Kailora, 300 meters overhead, its levitation grids leaking pale light in long, irregular strips. The strips fell across the market stalls like broken window blinds, illuminating patches of merchandise and leaving everything between in deep brown shadow. Elira had studied atmospheric maps of Holloway. She had read reports, filed by the Mnemosyne Council's field surveyors, describing the population density, the contraband crystal trade, the average rate of cascade incidents per quarter. None of that had prepared her for the smell. She pressed 2 fingers to the scanner tucked inside her right sleeve, felt it pulse against her wrist. Alive. Running. The neural fingerprint was a sequence she had spent 5 years memorizing, the specific oscillation frequency of Sienna's memory crystal signature, as unique to her daughter as the pattern of a thumbprint or the architecture of a laugh. Elira had calibrated the scanner herself 3 nights ago, working from the original mapping data she'd preserved in the cold case alongside Sienna's last crystal. The device could read resonance from approximately 4 meters. In a crowded market, that range was almost useless. Almost. She needed to be close. A shoulder caught her from behind, hard enough to tilt her forward. She caught herself on the edge of a stall, fingers gripping rough-cut timber, and turned to find no one looking back. The foot traffic moved the way water moves through a narrow pipe, with pressure without apology. People here were accustomed to contact, to invasion of space. She was not, and she felt that difference like a sign stapled to her back. The stall she'd grabbed belonged to a woman selling memory filters, secondhand, sorted in cracked acrylic trays by color spectrum, blues and grays for episodic storage, greens for procedural, reds in a locked box, the woman's hand resting near it with practiced casualness. Elira looked at the reds and looked away quickly. She moved deeper into the market. The scanner pulsed again. Twice. She'd programmed 2 pulses for signal detected, faint. She was still searching. She adjusted her route, drifting left toward a row of stalls hung with canvas sheeting that had once been something else, sail material, maybe, or the lining of an atmospheric barge. The canvas was printed with old slogans she couldn't quite read in the low light. Remember to live. And below that, half bleached out, what you carry is what you are. She wondered which faction had printed them first. A child ran in front of her. Boy, maybe 7, barefoot on the pitted flooring, chasing something that had skittered beneath a stall. He disappeared under the canvas without slowing. Elira stepped around the space he'd left and kept her chin down, her eyes moving in the careful way she'd practiced on the lift cage coming down. Not the sweep of someone searching, but the restless, unfocused blink of someone who'd rather be elsewhere. The look of a person with a purpose they didn't want to discuss. It was harder to maintain than it sounded. Every time the scanner pulsed, her body wanted to turn, wanted to orient like a compass needle toward the source, toward Sienna. She made herself walk straight. Ahead, the market widened into what the council's report had called the Exchange Oval, a roughly circular open space where the larger dealers operated. The ceiling here was high enough that the bottom edge of Kailora disappeared into haze, and someone had strung hundreds of empty crystal casings on wire between the support columns, so they caught the leaking light and threw it in small, fragmented patches across the ground. It was almost beautiful, the way debris sometimes was, like a chandelier assembled from other people's waste. Elira moved into the oval and immediately felt exposed. Here the traffic was slower, more deliberate. People stopped to examine merchandise, to argue price, to lean close and speak in registers that didn't carry. There were children sitting on the floor playing a game with smooth stones. There were elderly people in folding chairs with the look of those who had nowhere else to go and had stopped pretending that bothered them. And there were others who moved the way Elira was trying to move, with studied disinterest, which meant they were almost certainly watching everything. The scanner pulsed 3 times. 3 pulses was signal detected, moderate. She was closer. Her breath shortened. She made herself slow it, made herself step to the left side of the oval and browse the nearest stall, which sold hollowed crystal casings for home storage. The vendor was a thin man with a jaw that worked constantly on something he never seemed to swallow. He didn't look at her. She picked up a casing and turned it over in her hands, watching her own fingers so they wouldn't betray her by trembling. Sienna's fingerprint was built from 6 years of her daughter's mapped neural activity. From the very first experimental scan, Alira had run when Sienna was 4 years old and had pressed her small face against the resonance plate and said it tickled. She'd been so young. The technology had been so new, so full of promise. Alira had believed, with the clean certainty of someone who hasn't yet been wrong about anything important, that mapping a child's cognitive signature was a gift. Something she was building for Sienna, a record of who she was in case memory itself ever failed. She put the crystal casing down. A woman to her left was arguing quietly with a dealer about the provenance of a rose-tinted memory shard. The dealer kept saying the same word, which was authenticated. The woman kept shaking her head. Alira angled her body to give them privacy she didn't feel. The scanner pulsed again, 3 times, same signal strength. She'd stopped getting closer. She needed to turn. She needed to turn right, toward the center of the oval, where the largest dealers arranged themselves in a loose cluster around a raised platform that served no apparent purpose except to let the most powerful people in the space stand slightly above everyone else, which was purpose enough, she supposed. She turned slowly and let her gaze travel across the center of the market. The stalls here were different, better lit for one thing. Whoever ran them had sourced actual lamps, warm amber, the kind that cost enough to be a statement. The merchandise wasn't laid out in trays but displayed in cases, behind scratched glass panels, with handwritten cards describing each crystal's contents in careful euphemisms. Military service, first love, professional loss. She'd seen the same taxonomy on the black market reports. The council's clinical language mapped perfectly onto the street's selling language, because grief turned out to be a very stable economy. The scanner pulsed 4 times, 4 pulses, signal strong. Alira's hand pressed flat against her own sternum, briefly, involuntarily. She pressed through the coat until she could feel the edge of the device through the cloth, then released her hand and let it fall. She moved toward the center stalls. The crowd was denser here. She had to thread between people, turning sideways, apologizing once when she stepped on someone's heel. The man she'd stepped on glanced back at her, then away. His eyes were filmed over with the gray-white opacity she associated with multiple cascade exposure, someone who'd been in the wrong place when too many crystals shattered at once. The gray didn't mean blindness. It meant the world behind the eyes was crowded. She kept moving. Past a woman braiding something into a child's hair with mechanical patience. Past a dealer who had turned his back to the market entirely and was examining something small in the cup of his palm, tilting it toward the amber light, watching it turn. Past an old ventilation grate in the floor that exhaled a gust of warmer air from below, carrying the ghost of burnt circuitry. 4 pulses again. Then, before she could breathe out, 5 pulses. Signal very strong. Her throat tightened. She had tested the scanner on Sienna's stored crystal before leaving the lab, had sat in the cold case room with the temperature turned down until her fingers ached and held the scanner up to the sealed container, and the thing had given her 5 pulses even through the casing's protective shell. 5 pulses was as strong as it got. 5 pulses was the reading for Sienna's actual crystal. Somewhere in this crowd, within 4 meters of where she stood, there was a memory that carried her daughter's resonance. She stopped between 2 stalls and let the crowd move around her. A man in an orange vest gave her a sharp look as he passed, the look of a market regular clocking someone who'd stopped where people didn't stop. She made herself move again, a slow drift to the left, toward a stall displaying large-format crystals in a case that reached almost to shoulder height. The vendor was talking to a customer, not watching merchandise. Her eyes moved over the case. Episodic fragments in the lower tier. Larger compounds in the middle. And in the top tier, behind the heaviest panel of glass, 4 crystals separated from the others by small wooden dividers. 3 of them were the gray-white of old, cooled memories. The 4th was gold. Not the faded amber of a well-handled stone, but actual gold, the color of something that still held heat. The scanner pulsed against her wrist, once for confirmation, then again. 555, rapid fire, the reading tipping over into something she hadn't programmed for because she hadn't believed she'd ever be close enough to need it. The gold crystal pulsed in return, faint and steady, like a second heartbeat. Alira's hand moved toward the glass before she caught it. She pressed her palm flat against the case instead, feeling the cool of the glass, using it as an anchor. The vendor was still talking. The customer was shaking his head. Neither of them had looked at her. She was a woman in a coat that was slightly too clean, standing with her hand pressed against someone else's glass case, in a market where being memorable was the most dangerous thing you could be. She made herself step back, made herself look at the stall beside it, the one selling memory filters, before looking back. The casual circuit of a browser. She had 4 meters and a signal and no plan for what came next, because she had believed, at some level she hadn't fully examined until this moment, that she would not actually find it. That she would descend and search and come back up empty, with the grim confirmation that there was nothing to find and nothing left to do but learn, again, to live with the shape of what she'd lost. Instead, she was standing in Holloway Market with her daughter's resonance pulsing against her wrist, looking at a gold crystal in a locked case, and somewhere near her, behind her, a large man in a gray coat was watching her with the particular stillness of someone paid to notice people who stopped where they shouldn't stop. She felt him before she saw him. Not a sound. A change in the air, the way a crowd rearranges itself around something that the crowd instinctively knows to leave room for. She turned her head just enough. Gray coat, arms loose at his sides, not looking at the merchandise, looking at her. Alira turned back to the case, heart moving now in her chest like something that wanted out, and she looked at the gold crystal one more time. Steady pulse, warm light. Her daughter's laugh, maybe, or her daughter's name, said in her own small voice. Or something older and further down, the feeling of being held before Sienna had words for what holding was. She turned away from it and walked toward the far edge of the oval with the deliberate, unhurried stride of someone with nowhere in particular to be, and the scanner pulsed 5 times against her wrist in diminishing signal, and each pulse felt like losing ground. She had made it 12 steps from the case when the sound reached her, not an explosion. Something worse, a crack that was also a frequency, high and clean as a finger run around the rim of a glass, followed by the absolute silence that happens when every body in a space registers danger before the mind can name it. Then the silence broke open. The smell arrived first. Burnt sugar, thick and wrong, coating the back of her throat like syrup poured into the wrong container. And under it, pressed beneath it, a child's bedroom in summer, the specific warmth of sun through thin curtains, talcum powder and something floral and gone. The smell of someone's early life, forced into Alira's sinuses whether she wanted it or not. She stopped walking. Around her, the market had fractured. Not everyone reacted at once. The cascade moved outward from a central point she hadn't yet seen, like a stone dropped in still water, and she watched it reach each person in sequence. A blink, a stumble, a hand pressed over the mouth. A woman 3 stalls ahead dropped her bag and simply stood there, looking at something Alira couldn't see. A man to her left sat down on the market floor with the precision of someone who had decided this was where he lived now. One of the children screamed. Alira turned. Behind her, near the center of the oval, the large man in the gray coat had his hands pressed to his temples. He was no longer interested in her. His knees were beginning to bend. She identified the source, a stall she'd passed without stopping, midway through the oval, where a dealer in a red jacket had been examining something small in his palm. He was still at his stall. He was still standing. But his merchandise case had shattered outward from below, and on the cleared space of his counter sat the jagged halves of what had been a large trauma crystal, black-veined and split clean through, still leaking faint violet smoke in thin, curling threads. A shattered crystal. A large one. The violet smoke meant recent, meant the echo was still active, still broadcasting. She had written 3 papers on cascade recall. She knew the mechanism precisely. Shattered crystals released not just stored sensory data, but the emotional context in which those memories had been formed. And that context was contagious in the way grief was contagious, in the way one person crying in a quiet room made the room feel different even for people who didn't know why they were sad. Trauma crystals carried the most saturated emotional charge. They were black-veined because the encoding pressure had been extreme. Shattering one in an enclosed space was the cognitive equivalent of setting off a flare inside a crowded theater. She knew all of this, knowing it did not help at all. The burnt sugar smell deepened. She tasted it now on her tongue. And behind it, layering in like voices joining a chord, came something else. The sensation of cold water around her ankles, not water she'd touched in any memory of her own. And under that a sound that was barely a sound, a low frequency that pressed behind her eyes like the beginning of a headache, except that it wasn't pain exactly but pressure, the pressure of something that needed to be felt and was being felt in a body that hadn't asked for it. She took a step backward. Her boot caught the edge of something and she staggered, put her hand out, found the canvas side of a stall, held on. The man in the red jacket was sitting on his counter now, hands hanging between his knees, staring at the broken crystal with an expression that looked like the first stage of something that would take a long time to finish. Around the oval, the cascade was spreading. She could track it by the sounds. A sob from somewhere to the left, guttural and surprised, as if the person hadn't known they were going to make it. A crash where someone had knocked over a merchandise case. The child who had screamed had stopped screaming and was now laughing, high and thin, and that was worse. The old woman Alira had passed in the folding chair was on her feet, arms extended, turning in slow circles as if she was looking for something she couldn't name. Alira needed to move. Her legs had stiffened. The cascade's edge was touching her now, not fully, not the way it was hitting the people at its center, but enough. The burnt sugar smell had acquired a memory she didn't have, a specific kitchen that was not her kitchen, a window above a sink showing a yard where something white was hanging on a line. And she knew this was not hers, but it felt true in the way only sensation can, bypassing the part of the mind that categorizes and goes straight into the body. She shook her head hard. Twice, a technique she'd read about in a cascade exposure study, physical disruption of the proprioceptive sense could partially interrupt sensory contamination. It helped, a little. She pushed off the canvas and made herself walk toward the far edge of the market. The oval was changing fast. People who weren't affected yet were trying to leave, which meant the paths out were narrowing. She could see 2 exits from here. The passage she'd entered through to her right, already clogged with bodies moving in both directions at once, and a narrower opening to her left that looked onto a service corridor, dark, hanging pipes visible from here, nobody going that way because nobody wanted what was in the dark. She wanted the dark. The dark was away from the cascade's center. She turned left and walked faster. The scanner pulsed against her wrist. She'd forgotten it. 5 pulses, then 4, then 3 in quick succession as she moved away from the center stalls, and then her body reacted before her mind caught up. She stopped. She turned back toward the gold crystal. It was still there, behind its glass. The vendor had abandoned his stall, his chair empty, his amber lamp still burning, and the locked case sat open now where he'd knocked it in leaving. The glass panel hung at an angle from its hinge. The contents were exposed. The cascade was still moving. The sounds from the center of the oval were changing in register, becoming less individual, more collective. A low hum of distress, punctuated by the sharp sounds of things breaking where someone fell or fled. She had maybe seconds before the enforcers arrived, maybe less, because the Holloway enforcers didn't always wait for cascade events to finish before wadding in. And when they arrived, they would neutralize anyone they found at the source, dealer or bystander or scientist from the high islands with a scanner on her wrist and a missing daughter's resonance cycling 5 beats against her skin. She went back. 10 steps at a run, ducking past the turning old woman, skirting the edge of the space that the man in the gray coat had created by sitting down on the floor. He was rocking slightly, hands still pressed to his head, and she stepped around him wide, keeping her eyes on the case. The burnt sugar smell spiked. For a moment she was in that kitchen she didn't know, sun through the window, something hanging on the line outside going in and out of her chest like breath, and she pushed through it and reached the stall and put her hand into the open case. The gold crystal was warm, not the warmth of something left in the sun. A different kind, a living warmth, the warmth of the space inside a cupped hand. She closed her fingers around it, and the scanner went silent against her wrist, the way it went silent when the signal was too strong to pulse, when the proximity collapsed the signal into something the device simply registered as constant and stopped reporting by degree. And then the crystal spoke to her, not in words. She'd spent 5 years working with memory crystals, and she knew the difference between a recording and a presence, between a crystal that stored an event and a crystal that stored a self. A recording gave you sensation, sound, smell, the ghost of touch. A presence gave you something with no precise scientific name that she'd ever managed to publish, though she'd tried twice, in papers that were politely declined as speculative. A presence gave you direction. Attention turned toward you from the inside of the stone. This was not a recording. The warmth in her palm focused, the way a scattered light beam focuses when passed through a lens. It didn't burn. It pressed. It pressed the way Sienna had pressed her face against the resonance plate at 4 years old, that same curiosity, that same leaning in. Alira's knees went soft. She caught herself on the stall counter. Mama, not a word. The shape of the impulse that precedes a word, the neural firing that is the intention of speech before the throat makes sound. But she knew it. She had spent 41 years with a body that had been shaped by motherhood, and 5 of those years waiting for exactly this. And she knew the shape of that particular reaching out the way she knew the shape of her own hand. The cascade recall broke over her fully then, as if her moment of recognition had opened a door she'd been holding shut. The burnt sugar became something specific. Caramelized apples, the kind Sienna had watched her make every autumn, standing on the step stool at the counter, stirring too hard and splashing, and the warm, sweet smoke had caught in her hair, and she'd smelled it on the child for hours afterward. And then that smell layered under another. The clean, cold antiseptic of the lab, her own lab, the night of the experiment, Sienna on the mapping table making jokes about the electrode cap being too big, saying it made her look like a satellite dish, and Alira laughing, actually laughing, not knowing that within 4 minutes she would look up and find the table empty. She was crying. She didn't know when she'd started. The crystal pulsed in her hand. Once. Gently. Like a correction. Not the past, not now, I'm here.
You're here,
she said, and her voice came out wrong, too raw, stripped of the careful evenness she'd spent 5 years maintaining. She closed both hands around the crystal and pressed it against the front of her coat, against the sternum, where she could feel her own pulse and the crystal's warmth together. Somewhere behind her, boots on the market floor, more than one pair. The specific cadence of people who wore boots for what boots could do rather than where they were going. Enforcers. She heard a voice, amplified by a throat piece, giving a directive in the clipped syntax of Holloway enforcement. Disperse, emergency protocol, all unlicensed vendors are to remain. The cascade was still moving. Someone nearby laughed again, that high thin laugh, and someone else was saying a name over and over that didn't seem to be their own. Alira put the crystal inside her coat. Against her skin, inside the waistband of her trousers, held there by the pressure of the fabric. It burned with warmth. She felt it against her ribs like a second pulse, settling into sync with her first. She stood up straight and became someone with nowhere particular to be, someone who had seen something unpleasant, and was leaving with the slightly hurried composure of a person who valued composure. She walked away from the stall. She did not run. Her hands were steady because she had decided they would be, and she was very good at deciding. The service corridor was 30 feet away, then 20, then close enough that she could see the pipes overhead were sweating in the warm air from below, fat drops of condensation catching the distant amber light. An enforcer stepped into the corridor opening ahead of her. He was young. The faceplate of his enforcement helm was fogged from the thermal differential between the corridor and the market. He was looking at the chaos of the oval, not at her, and he had the expression of someone who had trained for situations and was now living inside one and discovering that the training had left several relevant details out. Alira walked straight toward him.
Cascade event,
she said, in the voice she used at Mnemosyne Council briefings, the voice that arrived already carrying authority, that didn't ask whether it was being listened to.
Central Oval, trauma-grade black-veined crystal, vendor in red jacket. You'll want your containment team. That cascade is grade 3 minimum, possibly 4.
He looked at her. The fogged faceplate meant she couldn't see his eyes, only the shape of his attention shifting.
Who are you with?
He said.
Research oversight,
She said, which was technically the name of no organization, but sounded like the name of every organization. And she kept walking, putting her shoulder past him into the corridor, and he turned to track her because a person walking away from you is harder to interrogate than a person standing still.
I'll need your identifier.
He said.
It's Voss.
She said, from behind him now, moving into the dark of the corridor, where the pipes sweated and the market sounds became muffled and the amber light didn't reach.
File a report with the analytical division. They'll verify.
There was no analytical division. She walked faster once the dark had her, faster and then running, the crystal warm against her ribs, her daughter's not-quite voice pressing into her skin like a hand held flat against a door. Below her boots, the floor vibrated with the distant labor of the island's gravity systems, and she ran toward the lift cage and the cold air above and the lab where she could be alone with this. The understanding that had cracked open in her chest back there at the stall, in the middle of someone else's burnt sugar grief. Sienna wasn't a recording. Sienna wasn't a fragment. She was somewhere inside that crystal, the whole of her, compressed and frightened and small, pressing her face toward the warmth of recognition the way she had pressed her face against the resonance plate at 4 years old, leaning in. Not gone, hidden, and someone had put her there.